My name's Jake. I'm 41 years old, live just outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, and for most of my adult life, truly believed, that family was about loyalty, sacrifice, and showing up. I worked two jobs for years just to make sure my parents didn't drown in debt, paid their rent, covered their medical bills, fixed their car when it broke down in the middle of the winter. I didn't complain, not out loud anyway. That's just what you do for family, right? Except one evening not too long ago, I found out I wasn't family the way I thought I was. It was supposed to be a routine Sunday dinner. One of those awkward, overly polite meals where my dad cleared his throat a lot and my mom pretended not to notice the tension. I thought maybe they were finally going to thank me for everything I'd done, or at least acknowledge it. Instead, my dad leaned forward, elbows on the table like he was conducting a damn board meeting, and told me flat out that I was a burden, that I'd ruined their lives. He didn't even raise his voice. That was the worst part. He said it so matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. And my mom? She nodded, not in hesitation, in agreement. It was like my chest collapsed in on itself. But I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I smiled. I stood up. I walked out of that house like it was on fire, and I just realized I'd been the one burning the whole time. Then I went home, packed a bag, and left. No warning. No speech. Just gone. And here's the kicker. I was the one paying their bills. Yeah, let that sit. That night, I checked into a cheap motel off I-40. Nothing fancy, just a bed, silence, and a lock on the door that I controlled. I turned off my phone for the first time in years. Just powered it down and let the quiet sink in. It was the kind of silence that didn't just wrap around you. It settled into your bones. Around midnight, I turned my phone back on. Curiosity. Masochism. I don't know. But there it was, one message. From my mother. For words, don't come back here. No, we need space. No, let's talk. Just a digital eviction notice from the woman who used to hold my hand when I was sick. That broke something else inside me, but not in the way she probably hoped. There were no tears. No panic. Just a weird, hollow laugh. So I replied with one word. Okay. Then I opened the banking apps. All of them. I canceled the auto pays on their utilities. Cut off the credit cards they had access to. Removed myself from anything tying me to their lives financially. They wanted me gone? I was gone in every sense. And let me tell you, I've never felt lighter. But I should have known that peace was just the eye of the storm. Because the next morning, my phone lit up like it owed someone money. By 8:17 the next morning, my phone had already rung 12 times. 12. Missed calls from my dad, my mom, and even one from a number I didn't recognize but had that same area code. Texts started coming in like a flood, not just from them, but from neighbors, my cousin Leah, even a guy named Chuck who used to mow their lawn back in the day. Apparently, my parents had started telling people I'd abandoned them. Claimed I'd cut them off without warning, left them destitute. That was the word they used. Destitute. Meanwhile, I've been paying their damn rent 3 days before that little family ambush. But sure, let's play victim now that the ATM grew legs and walked away. Then came the voicemail from my dad. 3.5 minutes of guilt-laced poison. He talked about how I'd always been difficult, how they had sacrificed so much for me growing up, how Eric, my jobless, freeloading brother, would never have treated them this way. I didn't listen to the whole thing. I couldn't. But I saved it. Not out of sentimentality. Out of strategy. The final straw? I got a knock on the door around 10 a.m. It was a man in a beige blazer, holding a clipboard and a photo. My photo. Said he was a private investigator, just trying to check on my welfare. Yeah, right? He wasn't there for me. He was there for my bank account. I didn't invite the guy in. Just stood there in the doorway, watching him shift uncomfortably under the New Mexico sun like a vacuum salesman who realized he'd knocked on the wrong door. He said my parents were worried about me, that they hadn't heard from me since the misunderstanding. That word, misunderstanding, really stuck in my teeth. I told him, politely but firmly, that I was alive, well, and didn't need anyone checking in on me unless they were here to bring tacos or peace of mind. And clearly, he had neither. Then I closed the door. Didn't slam it. Just a calm, deliberate shut. A punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I hadn't realized I'd been writing for years. I sat back down on the motel bed and just breathed. Not deeply, not dramatically, just normally. For the first time in what felt like forever. See, here's the thing no one ever tells you about being the good kid. You end up being useful. And once people see you that way, dependable, helpful, convenient, they stop seeing you as a person. You become a resource, a solution, a safety net that never tears, never frays, never snaps back. Until you do. That morning, their panic was my peace. Every call I ignored, every text I left on read. It was like laying bricks in the foundation of the new life I was building. One where I wasn't the emergency contact, the bailout plan, the stand-in parent for a grown man who thought Xbox achievements were career milestones. Eric, I hadn't even mentioned him in all this, had I? While my parents were spiraling, he finally decided to pipe up. Sent me this long-winded voice message like we were old pals reconnecting. So the whole thing had gotten out of hand, that I was overreacting, that our parents were just stressed. He even had the gall to say he missed me. Missed me. This from a guy who once told me, to my face, that my job was basically just typing and taxes, and that he'd never work a day in his life unless it paid in fame or Bitcoin. I didn't respond. I just listened to it once, shook my head, and deleted it. Not out of spite, but because it didn't belong in the new archive I was building. I wasn't saving anything anymore unless it served me. I went to the gym that afternoon for the first time in months. Not out of some big revenge body mission, but because I wanted to sweat out the last traces of who I used to be. I left my phone in the locker. And for an hour, I wasn't anyone's disappointment, anyone's scapegoat, anyone's investment. I was just a guy on a treadmill, running towards something I couldn't name yet, but knew wasn't behind me anymore. And then, as I was walking out into the parking lot, wiping sweat from my brow, I saw the tow truck, parked at the edge of the lot, engine running, driver leaning on the hood, looking right at me like he already knew my name. I didn't have time to ask questions, because I already knew what they'd done. They reported my car stolen. So there I was, staring at a tow truck driver who clearly didn't want to be part of this, but also wasn't leaving without my car. He looked at me like a man who's been given instructions he doesn't agree with but is paid too little to care. I walked over slowly, wiped my hands on my shirt, and asked him one question. Who sent you? He hesitated, then showed me the dispatch ticket. My dad's name. His signature, even. Claimed the car was unlawfully in possession. Never mind the fact that it was registered in my name, insured by me, and had been parked outside that very same house for years while they never once questioned it. Turns out, when someone is used to controlling you, your independence looks like theft. The guy wasn't aggressive. He even looked a little embarrassed. Said he'd have to report back, maybe come another day. I told him not to bother. I'd already made my next move. I didn't go back to the motel. I drove straight to the DMV and reported the attempted seizure. Showed them my title, my insurance, and a photo of the tow truck. The clerk looked at the documents, then at me, and said, almost under her breath, "This kind of thing happens more than you think." That's when it hit me. I wasn't special. I was just the latest in a long line of people who finally pulled the plug and watched their entire foundation throw a tantrum. The real shock came an hour later. I got a call from a friend of mine who works at a local credit union. The same one where I'd helped my parents open a joint emergency account years ago, just in case. Apparently, someone had tried to access it that morning. Not just check the balance. Full access request. Signature vérification. Attempted password reset. My dad again. This time I laughed. Not bitter, not angry. The kind of laugh you give when you realize someone thinks you're still playing checkers while you've been playing chess the whole damn time. I'd already emptied the account 2 weeks prior. Moved the funds to my own savings. Not a ton of money, just a few thousand I'd put their back when I still thought they were the emergency. And now, they were spiraling. But I wasn't done. That night, I went home. Not to a motel, not to a friend's couch, but to the new apartment I'd signed the lease for that morning. 1 bedroom, top floor, view of the Sandia Mountains. Quiet, clean, and more mine than any place I'd ever been. I sat on the balcony, sipped a beer, and let the silence crawl in. No te ve, no noise. Just the hum of a ceiling fan and the kind of stillness you only get when no one knows where you are and no one has the right to find you. And that's when I realized they weren't going to stop. Because people who see you as a tool don't miss you when you're gone. They panic that you're not fixable. And tools don't leave. But I did. The thing about cutting people off, really cutting them off, is that it doesn't just sever the obvious connections. It severs the shadow ones too. The ones you didn't even realize were tugging at you until the silence finally arrives. And for a little while, the silence was enough. But silence doesn't mean stillness. It's just the space where the real damage starts to echo. 3 days after the tow truck incident, I got an email. From my brother, Eric. The subject line? Can we just talk? I almost deleted it right then, but something, morbid curiosity, I guess, made me click. It was a long message. Rambling. Defensive. And it didn't take long to realize it wasn't an apology. It was a script. An act. The digital equivalent of crocodile tears. He talked about how he was under a lot of pressure lately, that our parents hadn't been the same since I left, and how they just didn't know how to handle it. He said they were old, confused, and scared. Then he slipped in the real reason for writing. He lost his job. Correction, he lost his side hustle selling resold electronics on eBay, which, surprise, surprise, wasn't actually paying anything to begin with. His girlfriend left. Rent was overdue. And our parents? Turns out they'd been giving him loans for months. Loans that were actually my money before I cut the cord. Suddenly, the desperation made sense. It wasn't just about punishing me. It was about survival. His survival. Eric was sinking, and when I stepped off the boat, he started to drown. That night, I sat in my new apartment, rereading his email. Not because I was considering helping. That ship had long sunk, but because I needed to see it for what it was, a confession wrapped in manipulation. He ended the message with, "We're still brothers, man." That has to mean something. I stared at that line for a long time. Not because it moved me, but because it proved he still didn't get it. He didn't want a brother. He wanted a bailout. And for years, I gave it to him, quietly, out of guilt, obligation, maybe even hope that he'd grow up. But when you keep handing someone a safety net, they don't learn to walk the wire. They learn to fall more comfortably. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just cut off my parents. I'd finally cut off him, too. There's a strange kind of freedom in knowing you don't owe anyone anything anymore. Not financially, not emotionally, not even a return text. I woke up the next morning and didn't check my phone. Didn't care if it buzzed. Let them scream into the void. I'd already moved on, but moving on didn't mean I was done. I spent that day getting my ducks in a row, cleaning up the little messes they thought I'd be too guilt-ridden or emotionally drained to notice. I removed myself from every account I had ever opened jointly with them. I made sure the cable, the electricity, the water, everything they relied on was either under their name or canceled outright. I even called their landlord to remove my name from their lease. They were 3 months into a renewal I had signed on their behalf. I explained the situation. The man sighed. He'd dealt with messy families before. Said he'd handle it. By noon, I'd done more for myself in 6 hours than I had in the last 6 years. And just when I thought the day was winding down, I checked the mail in my new apartment. There it was, a letter. Handwritten. No return address. I stood in my kitchen, turning it over in my hands like it might explode. The handwriting was familiar, but off. Too neat, too intentional. I opened it carefully, like peeling off a scab. It was from my mother. No salutation. No dir jaque. Just the kind of letter someone writes when they're not sure whether to beg or blame. She said she didn't understand why I'd turned my back on them after everything we've done for you. That she was hurt, that I had abandoned the people who raised you, and that she never expected her oldest son to act this way. Then came the line that made me sit down. You always had more than Eric. Why is it so hard to share? There it was. The truth in ink. Not love. Not fairness. Not confusion. Entitlement. She believed that because I had built something for myself, I owed them. Owed her. Oh, my father. Owed Eric. Not out of gratitude, but because I had dared to succeed where they had floundered. It was never about helping. It was about owing. That's when something in me, some old, frayed thread that had been holding out hope, finally snapped. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't even tear the letter up. I folded it back up neatly, tucked it into the drawer with the others, the will, the investigator's card, Eric's email, and closed it. Not as a keepsake, but as evidence. Because now I knew the war wasn't just emotional. It was legal, and they weren't going to go down quietly. 2 days after the letter from my mother, I got an official-looking envelope slid under my apartment door. No knock, no doorbell. Just the unmistakable whisper of cheap paper trying to ruin someone's peace. Inside, a letterhead from a law firm downtown, the kind of place that handled wills, family disputes, petty threats dressed up as professionalism. The letter said my parents were seeking restitution for breach of informal contract and financial abandonment. They wanted back payments. Claimed I had made an implied commitment to support them. It even suggested, not directly, but in that cowardly legalese way, that failure to comply could result in litigation. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Restitution? For what? Years of unpaid labor, emotional manipulation, and gaslighting. The best part? They used Eric's email as part of their case. Quoted him like he was a credible witness. Claimed I had promised to support the family as long as they needed it. A line Eric had once thrown at me after I covered his rent for the 3rd month in a row. This wasn't just an attack. It was a performance. A final, desperate attempt to make me the villain in a story they wrote. What they didn't know, I'd already retained a lawyer. Quietly. Thoroughly. A woman named Sandra I met through a friend, ex-military, smart as hell, and not the least bit afraid of so-called family drama. I forwarded her the letter, the voicemail, the texts, the PI's name, and, most importantly, the handwritten note from my mom. 10 minutes later, Sandra called. Her first words? They're not suing you. They're bluffing. But we're going to respond like they mean it. She crafted a response that wasn't just legally sound. It was surgical, calm, precise, completely void of emotion. It laid out a full record of financial support, transfers, timelines, and statements. She attached documentation proving I had no legal obligation to continue supporting them. And then, to drive the knife a little deeper, she included a clause stating that any future attempts to contact me directly or through a third party would be considered harassment. The letter ended with 5 words that made me feel more seen than anything my parents had ever said. My client will not return. I signed it without hesitation. Because this wasn't just a response. It was a declaration. I wasn't their son anymore. I was a survivor of their system. 3 days passed after Sandra sent the letter. 3 blissful, quiet, undisturbed days. No new calls. No emails. Nothing in the mailbox but takeout menus and junk flyers. It was the kind of silence that used to make me anxious. Now, it felt like peace. Until it didn't. On the 4th morning, I got a voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. No message. Just heavy breathing for 5 seconds and a click. Then came the second call. This time, a name I hadn't seen in years. Leah, my cousin. We hadn't talked since the last family reunion, and even then, she'd barely made eye contact. But her text came through like a live wire. Jake, you need to be careful. I don't know everything, but Eric is saying some messed up things. They're telling people you stole from your parents, that you're unstable, that you're dangerous. I stared at the screen, feeling that cold, old knot twist in my gut. For a second, I wanted to believe she was exaggerating. That maybe Eric was just mouthing off like always, dramatic, attention-seeking. But Leah wasn't like that. She never had been. She followed it with another message. I only know because Mom called me freaking out. Said Eric showed them screenshots of your texts. But the dates are weird. The tone's off. It didn't sound like you. Faked messages. Fabricated screenshots. They were trying to build a case. Or at least make it look like I was spiraling to friends, to family, maybe even to a judge if it came to that. It wasn't just damage control. It was character assassination. And Eric? He wasn't spiraling anymore. He was plotting. I called Sandra immediately. Told her what Leah said, forwarded the texts. Sandra was calm, surgical as always. She said we'd add it to the file. If they really tried anything in court, we'd be ready. She asked if I wanted to press charges for harassment. I said no, not yet. Not because I was afraid, because I wanted to watch them dig the hole deeper. That afternoon, I drove out to a quiet trailhead east of the city. Just needed to breathe, to get away from the invisible war they were waging behind closed doors. I hiked for an hour. No music, no phone service, just the sound of gravel under my boots and wind moving through the canyons. At the top of the ridge, I stood there looking out over everything. The houses below, the streets, the lives moving quietly without all this chaos. And I realized something. They couldn't actually touch me anymore. They could lie. They could twist the story. They could hire every 2-bit PI in New Mexico. But they couldn't own me again, because no matter what they said, I wasn't afraid of them anymore. It was a Tuesday when everything cracked wide open. I had just finished a call with Sandra. She was finalizing an affidavit documenting every cent I'd sent my parents over the years. Every transfer, every utility I paid, every time I bailed out Eric. It was thick enough to make a small book. She said, in her no-nonsense voice, if they try anything again, we won't just defend. We'll counterclaim. And then, like fate had perfect timing, I got a call. From Mrs. Carter, my parents' landlord. She wasn't just calling to say the rent was overdue again. She was calling to say she was evicting them. They told me you'd cover it, she said. Again, that it was all just a mistake. I told her, calmly, that I no longer had any financial ties to them. She paused, then sighed in that way people do when they finally realize they've been played. Said they hadn't paid in nearly 2 months. Said Eric had been the one emailing her, pretending to be me. He even used a fake email address. She forwarded everything to me. I stared at those messages for a long time. Not because I was surprised, but because of how lazy it was. Same phrases Eric always used. Same misspellings. He hadn't even tried to hide the con. That night, I called Leo again. She answered on the second ring, nervous, like she was waiting for bad news. But I didn't yell. I thanked her for the warning, for believing me. And that's when she said something that stuck with me. They thought they could keep using you because you never fought back. But now that you're fighting, they're scrambling. They don't know how to survive without your silence. That was it. That was the whole game. My silence was the system. And I'd turn it off. But the final nail came the next morning. Sandra sent me an email. Attached was a PDF, a signed retraction from the law firm that had sent the threat letter. A formal withdrawal of all claims. But that wasn't the twist. The twist came at the bottom of the email, in the form of a short message from the paralegal who'd sent it. Off the record, we're sorry. That family has issues we didn't want to be involved in any longer. I stared at those words like they were in neon. Even their lawyer walked away. The house of cards had fallen. And in the quiet that followed, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. Like the part of me that had been bracing for the next attack could finally exhale. Not because they had surrendered, but because I had won something better than revenge. Freedom.